The sound was subtle at first, barely more than a breath, but in a courtroom where every word carried the weight of law, even the faintest noise could cut like a blade. Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair, lips curling into the kind of smirk that spoke louder than any ruling. And then he chuckled, low, dismissive, dripping with condescension. The room stiffened. That single laugh, sharp and smug, echoed against the marble walls like an insult aimed not at just one woman, but at everything she represented. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett. For a fraction of a second, she didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't let the smirk pierce her armor. Instead, she paused, her eyes narrowed, locking on Kavanaugh with a steady, unblinking focus. The silence stretched, one beat, then another. The audience, journalists, aides, citizens, leaned forward instinctively, pulled into the tension of the moment. It wasn't just a laugh. It was a challenge, a dismissal of her right to speak, her right to stand, her right to confront power on equal ground. And in that instant, every immigrant who had been mocked for their accent, every woman who had been talked over in a boardroom, every citizen who had been told their vote didn't matter, could feel the sting of that chuckle. But Crockett was not rattled. If anything, the insult hardened her presence. The corners of her mouth tugged into something colder than a smile, a look that promised retribution, cloaked in calm. Her silence became heavier than Kavanaugh's laughter, pressing down on the chamber until even the air seemed to wait. Then she leaned forward, voice cutting through the stillness with icy precision. She hadn't yet spoken the words that would define this encounter, but already the energy had shifted. The smirk on Kavanaugh's face no longer looked certain. It looked nervous, because everyone in that room, from the clerks taking notes to the millions who would later see the clip online, sensed what was coming. This was no ordinary response. This was about to become the kind of moment replayed in history books, the kind of moment whispered in classrooms, the kind of moment that redefined what it meant to stand against arrogance. What Jasmine Crockett said next would silence not just Kavanaugh, but the entire courtroom, and soon the nation. This was no routine courtroom sparring match. Behind the polished oak benches and the echo of formality hung a far greater weight. The question of whose voice truly mattered in America. The issue at stake was nothing less than voting rights, the heartbeat of democracy itself. Across the nation, millions were watching anxiously, aware that the rulings and debates within these walls could determine whether their ballots would carry meaning or be swallowed by silence. For many, faith in the system had already been shaken. Stories of long lines in certain neighborhoods, voter IDs rejected without explanation, and districts redrawn to muffle minority voices had painted a portrait of democracy under siege. Families sat at kitchen tables worrying aloud. Is the promise of equality under the law slipping through our fingers? At barber shops, in college classrooms, and on factory floors, the refrain was the same. People feared that the rules of the game were being bent to serve the powerful, while ordinary citizens were left with nothing but frustration. And so, when Representative Jasmine Crockett entered that courtroom, she did not walk in as just another politician arguing a case. She carried with her the weight of those fears, the hopes of communities that had been told they were too loud, too different, too powerless to matter. To many, she was the underdog stepping into the lion's den, surrounded by towering figures in black robes whose very presence radiated authority. Justice Kavanaugh embodied that authority, his chuckle a reminder of the imbalance in the room. He sat elevated, cloaked in tradition, wielding the power to interpret the Constitution itself. Crockett, by contrast, was positioned below, her words subject to interruption, her arguments vulnerable to mockery. The contrast was cinematic, the insider versus the outsider, the voice of privilege against the voice of persistence. Yet history has always favored those who dared to speak when silence would have been safer. Crockett knew that her presence in that chamber was itself a victory, a testament to resilience, to communities that refused to be erased. Every step she had taken to get there had been uphill, every seat she had claimed contested. And now, the stakes had never been higher, because this was not simply about her sparring with Kavanaugh. This was about whether America's most fundamental promise, that each citizen matters equally, would survive the pressures of cynicism and control. If she faltered, the smirk would win, the chuckle would become a symbol of unchecked arrogance. But if she held steady, if she pierced through the laughter with clarity and conviction, she could ignite something far larger than herself. The nation watching from screens in living rooms and offices could sense it too. The murmurs online grew louder. Hashtags appeared. Commentators whispered of a showdown, and ordinary people braced themselves for a moment that might either confirm their despair or renew their faith. And in the middle of it all, Jasmine Crockett sat still, unflinching. She was no stranger to being underestimated, no stranger to being dismissed. That chuckle had been meant to diminish her. Instead, it only fueled the silence that preceded her strike. Kavanaugh leaned back, confident that his position, his robes, and his laugh had already written the ending. But he didn't see what was coming. Brett Kavanaugh did not arrive at this moment by accident. His career had been built on a steady climb through the corridors of privilege, paved with elite schooling, powerful networks, and the confidence of someone who had never truly been told no. To some, he was the portrait of success. To others, he was the embodiment of a system tilted in favor of the well-connected. And on this day, in this chamber, his every gesture carried the weight of that history. Watch closely, and you see it in the smirk. It's not the warm smile of reassurance, nor the laugh shared in camaraderie. It is the smirk of a man who believes the outcome is already written, that the debate is little more than theater. His lips curl ever so slightly, chin lifted, shoulders leaning back in calculated ease. Its body language designed not to engage, but to diminish, to project. I am untouchable. You are wasting your breath. This was not new. Over the years, Kavanaugh had become known for a style that blurred the line between confidence and condescension. In past hearings, when pressed by critics, he often responded with clipped dismissals, sighs heavy with irritation, or tones that suggested the question itself was beneath him. To allies, it looked like resolve. To opponents, it looked like arrogance. To the average American watching at home, it often looked like the kind of smugness they had endured from bosses, landlords, or officials who believed power granted them superiority. Controversies had followed him, too. His confirmation process to the Supreme Court was one of the most contentious in modern history, igniting protests in the streets and leaving scars on public trust. Allegations, fiery testimonies, and an air of political gamesmanship surrounded his ascent, cementing him as a lightning rod for debate. For many, his elevation to the bench did not feel like justice. It felt like entitlement rewarded. Even after taking the seat, his approach to questioning often leaned into sharpness, laced with a tone that seemed less about seeking clarity and more about establishing dominance. He had the look of a man who believed his robe gave him not just authority, but superiority. When lawyers or witnesses faltered under his gaze, he did not hide his satisfaction. That slight upward twitch of the lip, that chuckle he allowed to escape, these were not random tics. They were signals, signals to the courtroom, signals to the country. And now, in this confrontation with Jasmine Crockett, that pattern was repeating. The chuckle had not erupted by chance. It was the natural extension of years spent leaning on status to silence challenge. It was the sound of a man convinced that his position was shield enough, that anyone daring to question him would collapse under the weight of his authority. But this time, the audience was different. This time, the courtroom was not the only witness. Cameras were rolling, and the smirk was not just for Crockett. It was broadcast to millions, and millions recognized it. They had seen that same smirk on the faces of executives who denied their wages, on politicians who dismissed their communities, on gatekeepers who told them they did not belong. In that moment, Kavanaugh was no longer just a justice in a robe. He was the symbol of an entire structure that had for too long mocked the idea of equality, reduced the powerless to punchlines, and chuckled at the very notion that ordinary voices could challenge extraordinary privilege. Every shift of his shoulders, every narrowing of his eyes, reinforced the image. He was not listening to Crockett. He was waiting for her to stumble, eager for the chance to unleash another dismissive gesture. His posture radiated entitlement, as though the debate were already beneath him, as though her presence at the table was itself an inconvenience. But here lay the seed of his downfall, because the very qualities that once shielded him, his confidence, his networks, his unshakable air of superiority, were the same qualities that now painted him as the villain in this unfolding drama. And the more he smirked, the more the audience at home leaned in, silently rooting not for the man in robes, but for the woman staring him down. They weren't just waiting for her rebuttal. They were hungry for it. They wanted to see arrogance humbled. They wanted to see the smirk wiped clean. Kavanaugh didn't know it yet, but in this theater of power, his laugh had already cast him as the antagonist, and the story demanded that arrogance meet its reckoning. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin beneath the polished lights of a courtroom or in the spotlight of national politics. It began in places where struggle was not an abstract concept, but a daily reality, where families stretched paychecks until they broke, where communities were told to wait their turn for justice that never seemed to arrive. She grew up surrounded by the quiet strength of people who worked hard, prayed harder, and endured the grinding weight of systems built to overlook them. From an early age, she understood what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers who doubted her potential, officials who dismissed her concerns, peers who assumed she would remain in the margins. Each slight became fuel, while others might have folded under the pressure of low expectations. Crockett let those moments forge a kind of steel in her character. She was determined not only to rise, but to make her rise count for something greater than herself. Education became her weapon. Every book, every debate, every hour spent studying late into the night was an act of defiance against a society that quietly suggested girls from her background should know their place. She refused that script. By the time she pursued law, it was clear that this was not ambition for ambition's sake. It was mission. It was about carving open doors that had been shut on others, about amplifying voices that had been ignored for generations. Her early legal career told the same story. She didn't seek the comfortable path, the cushy law firms with safe clients. Instead, she threw herself into advocacy work, representing those who couldn't afford the powerful attorneys stacked against them. She stood with tenants facing eviction, workers cheated out of wages, citizens who believed the system was too rigged to fight. In every courthouse, in every case file, she carried the echo of her community. and it wasn't easy. There were nights when the weight of loss nearly crushed her. Cases where the system's bias was so blatant, it left her shaking with frustration. Cases where victories were small, but the sacrifices immense. But Crockett learned resilience the way others learned arithmetic. It became second nature. She picked herself up again and again, because the alternative was surrender, and surrender had never been an option. Her fire drew people in. In speeches, she did not speak like a distant politician rehearsing talking points. She spoke like someone who had lived the struggle herself. Her words carried grit, edge, and authenticity. Crowds leaned in, not because she told them what they wanted to hear, but because she told them what she had lived, what they had lived. She was proof that the powerless could find their voice, and that voice could carry into the highest halls of power. So when Crockett walked into that courtroom, she wasn't just Jasmine Crockett, representative. She was Jasmine Crockett, daughter of a community that had fought tooth and nail for recognition. She was Jasmine Crockett, attorney who had refused to trade compassion for comfort. She was Jasmine Crockett, woman of color, in a chamber that had too often dismissed both her gender and her race as liabilities. Every ounce of doubt she had endured prepared her for the smirk across the bench. Every courtroom where she had been interrupted, every time a colleague had talked over her, every time she had been told, "You don't belong here," they all converged into this moment. Because if she could endure all of that, she could endure a chuckle, and more than endure, she could answer it. That was why her stillness in the face of Kavanaugh's laughter was so powerful. To the casual observer, it looked like hesitation. To those who knew her story, it looked like strategy. She had been here before, not in this exact room, not facing this exact man, but in the broader battle against arrogance cloaked in power. She knew the cost of losing her composure. She knew the power of timing. Her silence was not whackness. It was the calm before the strike. And millions watching across the country didn't just see a representative going head-to-head with a Supreme Court justice. They saw themselves. They saw the young girl told her dreams were too big. The worker told his voice was too small. The immigrant told their name was too foreign. They saw all the moments they had been mocked, minimized, and laughed at. And they saw, in Jasmine Crockett, the possibility that those moments did not have to end in defeat. She was carrying more than her own pride into that chamber. She was carrying the pride of every community whose struggle had been treated as a punchline. And for her, this was not performance. It was destiny. Her past had prepared her for this exact moment. The air inside the chamber was thick, each word spoken carrying a charge that seemed to reverberate long after it landed. Crockett began to lay out her case, voice steady, precise, and sharpened like a blade. She spoke of the Constitution not as a relic to be admired, but as a living promise, meant to protect every citizen equally. She painted pictures with her words. Families waiting in hours-long lines to vote. Young people being turned away for lacking the right identification. Communities of color fighting uphill battles against maps drawn to dilute their power. Her tone was calm, but underneath it was steel. Each sentence landed with intention, each phrase a brick building toward something greater. And then, just as she began to strike at the heart of the matter, how these manipulations were not mistakes, but deliberate acts to suppress democracy, the sound broke the rhythm, a chuckle. Low, dismissive, unmistakable. Justice Kavanaugh leaned back slightly, arms folded, eyes fixed on Crockett, with the faintest trace of amusement curling his lips. The laugh was not loud, but in the solemn quiet of the chamber it was deafening. It was a punctuation mark, designed not to clarify, but to undermine. Gasps rippled through the room. Some tried to hide their surprise, others exchanged quick glances. But everyone felt the shift. It was the same gesture people had endured in countless rooms. The boss who laughed when you made a suggestion, the teacher who chuckled at your question, the official who found amusement in your struggle. The sound was universal, and it cut deep. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes held steady, her posture unbroken. Where others might have faltered, she grew sharper. Instead of shrinking beneath the weight of mockery, she leaned into it, letting the silence after his chuckle stretch long enough for the audience to feel the insult settle. Her words resumed, but now they carried a different edge. She dissected the Constitution's promise of equal protection, her tone calm, yet commanding. Each line more forceful than the last. The tension in the room tightened like a wire drawn to its breaking point. Even those who had been skeptical began to sense the imbalance shifting, as if Crockett's resolve was beginning to eclipse the authority cloaked in robes. And the audience, both inside the chamber and those watching across the nation, felt it too. Whispers swirled through the seats. Could she really turn this around? Could dignity withstand derision? The question hung heavy, unanswered, electrifying the atmosphere. Kavanaugh's smirk remained, but the confidence behind it wavered. His body language spoke volumes, shoulders a little too stiff, gaze a little too fixed, as though the chuckle had been a reflex he now had to defend. He had meant to unsettle her, to reduce her words to background noise beneath his amusement. Instead, he had given her the very opening she needed, because Crockett wasn't just speaking to him. She was speaking to history, to the millions who knew exactly how it felt to be laughed at when the stakes were highest. She carried their indignation in her voice, their dignity in her stance, and with each word, the room's energy shifted further, turning that smirk into something fragile, exposed. The silence that followed her last point was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of anticipation. Something was building, something inevitable. The insult only fueled her next move, a strike no one saw coming. The silence, following Kavanaugh's chuckle, lingered like smoke after a gunshot. For a moment, the chamber seemed suspended in time, every eye fixed on Jasmine Crockett, every breath held, every heartbeat quickening in anticipation. She could have chosen to bristle, to fire back with anger, to let emotion lead her words. But Crockett had not come this far to lose herself to fury. She leaned into the quiet, let it grow heavy, let the room feel the insult for what it was. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, low at first, but so deliberate that it cut through the tension with surgical precision. "Justice Kavanaugh," she said, each syllable pronounced with measured care. "You may find it amusing to laugh at the struggles of ordinary Americans, but I assure you, those struggles are not a joke, not to me, and not to the millions who live them every single day." The words landed. They didn't explode. They sank in, heavy as iron. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a faint acknowledgement that the tone had shifted. The smirk on Kavanaugh's lips twitched, uneasy now, as though he had not expected such a cold, restrained counterpunch. Crockett paused, her eyes scanning the chamber before settling back on him. She allowed the silence to breathe, then continued. "You sit in that robe with the power to shape the destiny of this country. Yet in this moment, with one laugh, you revealed what too many already fear, that those entrusted with justice do not take the people's pain seriously. That when democracy cries out, you answer with a chuckle." The words struck deeper, Kavanaugh's shoulders stiffened, and his gaze broke for a second, darting down toward his notes before snapping back up. His body language betrayed what his smirk could no longer hide: discomfort. Crockett pressed forward, her voice steady, unwavering. "Do you know who else laughed, Justice Kavanaugh? Segregationists laughed when they said black children would never share classrooms with white ones. Politicians laughed when women demanded the right to vote. Power always laughs at the powerless, until the powerless rise." Gasps erupted from the audience. The parallel was unmistakable, bold, and unflinching. Crockett let the reaction swell for a beat before she leaned in again, her tone cooler now, like a blade drawn across glass. "But here's the truth. Those laughs never age well. They echo in history as shame, as arrogance, as a failure to see the inevitable tide of justice." The chamber was electric. What had started as a dismissive chuckle was now being reframed as the very symbol of oppression's fragility. Crockett was not just rebutting Kavanaugh. She was dismantling the meaning behind his laugh, brick by brick, until it stood naked as arrogance unmasked. Kavanaugh shifted again, adjusting in his chair, the smirk all but gone, his lips pressed thin, his jaw set tight. But the easy superiority had drained from his posture. He was no longer the arbiter observing with amusement. He was the man being observed, dissected, exposed. Crockett didn't relent. "I represent people who wait hours in lines to cast a ballot, only to be told their IDs don't count. I represent families who fear their voices will be swallowed by maps drawn to silence them. I represent communities who have been told for generations that their power doesn't matter. And when they hear you laugh, they don't hear humor. They hear dismissal. They hear a confirmation of their deepest fear, that those in power believe their voices are disposable." She stopped again, letting the words echo. Every pause was intentional, every silence an unspoken rebuke, more damning than a raised voice ever could be. Then came the pivot, the moment that would make headlines. Her voice sharpened, icy but resolute. "But let me make one thing perfectly clear. The people I represent are not disposable. Their rights are not optional, and their dignity will not be mocked, not by you, not by anyone." The chamber erupted in murmurs again, some gasps, some applause, stifled but undeniable. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the mic drop strike, the statement that reverberated like a gavel slamming down in judgment. Kavanaugh's face hardened. The smirk was gone, replaced by something almost human: irritation, discomfort, maybe even fear. The mask of untouchable confidence had cracked, and the entire country could see it. Crockett, however, remained calm, her expression steady. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't reveling in the shift. She was simply stating truth, as though it were self-evident, as though it had been waiting in the air all along, needing only her voice to bring it into focus. Her words slowed, deepened, carrying the rhythm of inevitability. History does not remember the chuckler's kindly justice. History remembers the courageous. History remembers those who stood, even when mocked, even when dismissed, even when told their place was beneath laughter. And I promise you this: the people will remember this moment, not your chuckle, but the silence that followed, when arrogance met dignity, and dignity refused to bow. The reaction inside the courtroom was palpable. Some sat stunned, others leaned forward, hungry for every syllable. Phones buzzed as reporters fired off messages, knowing they had just witnessed the line that would dominate headlines, the clip that would flood social media within minutes. And still, Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned back slightly, her voice softening but retaining its edge. You can laugh all you want, but the truth doesn't laugh back. It stands, it waits, and eventually it wins. That was it, the strike, the moment when silence was no longer empty but triumphant, when the imbalance of power tilted under the weight of one cold, deliberate response. For Kavanaugh, the smirk had evaporated, leaving only the image of a man caught in the glare of history's spotlight. For Crockett, it was not victory for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of being laughed at for daring to demand their dignity. The courtroom, once filled with tension, was now filled with something else. Recognition. Recognition that a shift had occurred, that arrogance had been checked, that dignity had spoken and silenced the room. And outside those walls, in homes and offices across the country, millions watched and felt it too. A cathartic release, a surge of validation, a reminder that even in the face of mockery, truth could still land like a gavel. But what came next? The ripple effects beyond the chamber would prove just how far this moment would travel and just how deeply it would shake the nation. The chamber had fallen into stunned silence, but outside its walls, the world was anything but quiet. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her cold, devastating response to Justice Kavanaugh's chuckle, it became more than a courtroom exchange. It became a national eruption. Within minutes, clips of her words spread across social media like wildfire. On Twitter, hashtags shot to the top of the trending list. Dignity vs. arrogance. Crockett mic drop. History does not laugh. Users from every corner of the country stitched together memes of Kavanaugh's fading smirk, side by side with Crockett's piercing stare. One viral image showed a gavel crashing down on the word chuckle, stamped beneath with Crockett's line, "History does not remember the chucklers kindly." TikTok was flooded with remixes of the moment. Some paired her words with triumphant soundtracks. Others slowed the clip down to highlight the exact second Kavanaugh's smug grin disappeared. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. Within hours, her rebuttal became monologue fodder, framed as the day dignity reclaimed the stage. Analysts on cable news spoke with uncharacteristic unity. A conservative panelist admitted reluctantly, "Whatever you think of her politics, that was composure. That was precision." Meanwhile, progressive commentators called it the moment dignity shut down arrogance on the highest stage. Editorials were written in real time. Crockett's rebuttal was no longer just an exchange. It was a defining political moment, one that would be dissected in classrooms, campaigns, and history books. Even critics who had spent months dismissing her as fiery but unpolished found themselves forced to acknowledge her control. One headline read, "Crockett delivers what many thought impossible." She silenced a Supreme Court justice without raising her voice. Another called it a study in power, how calm dismantles condescension. But the true ripple effect wasn't in newsrooms or cable studios. It was in the homes and hearts of ordinary citizens who saw themselves reflected in her stance. Immigrant families replayed the clip at dinner tables, parents telling their children, "This is how you face someone who thinks they're above you." Young activists clipped her lines into reels, using them as rallying cries. Truth doesn't laugh back, it stands. In church halls, union meetings, and college campuses, people spoke about feeling represented, not just politically, but emotionally. Crockett's response carried something beyond rhetoric. It carried validation for anyone who had ever been belittled, mocked, or told their struggle was insignificant. To them, her words were not abstract. They were personal, One viral post captured the sentiment perfectly. When he laughed at all of us. When she answered for all of us. The power of that connection turned a courtroom exchange into a cultural earthquake. Young voters, in particular, seized on the moment, describing it as proof that composure could be as revolutionary as protest, that silence, when wielded properly, could roar louder than anger. By the following morning, her words had already transcended the political bubble. Teachers played the clip in classrooms as an example of rhetorical mastery. Ministers quoted her in sermons. Even sports commentators slipped her lines into broadcasts, describing underdog victories as moments when the truth refused to laugh back. And yet, the buzz wasn't merely celebratory, it was mobilizing. Advocacy groups reported surges in sign-ups. Hashtag campaigns turned into fundraisers. Citizens who had grown weary of politics said they felt re-energized. Crockett had not only countered Kavanaugh in that chamber, she had ignited a renewed sense of collective pride among those who often felt ignored. But beneath the celebration, another question brewed. If one exchange could spark this kind of fire, what would come next? Would the establishment push back harder? Would Crockett herself become a target? Or had she just shifted the balance of momentum in ways no one yet fully understood? Whatever the answer, one truth had already solidified. Her words had broken through the noise. They were etched into the political moment, replayed endlessly, remembered not just as a rebuttal, but as a declaration, and as the nation scrolled, shared, and whispered about what had unfolded, the air carried a sense of anticipation. Something larger had been set in motion, something no chuckle could ever dismiss. In the days that followed, as the noise of pundits and the churn of social media continued, Jasmine Crockett stood firm in her message. Reporters pressed her for sound bites. Commentators tried to fit her words into partisan boxes, but she refused to let the moment be cheapened. For her, it was never about winning a headline. It was about telling a deeper truth. When asked if she was offended by Kavanaugh's laughter, her response was calm, deliberate, and unforgettable. Respect is not given by titles. It is earned by character. That line cut through the noise like a bell ringing in the distance. It was more than a retort to a single justice. It was a reminder to every citizen that the measure of a person is not the robe they wear, the office they hold, or the power they inherit. It is in how they treat others when the spotlight is brightest, when dignity is tested, when the temptation to belittle is strongest. Her words reframed the entire encounter. What had started as a courtroom exchange transformed into a parable about the nation itself. America, Crockett suggested, is at its best not when it glorifies arrogance, but when it honors character. Not when it laughs off the struggles of its people, but when it listens, patiently and seriously, to their cries for justice. She reminded audiences that mockery may win a moment, but truth endures across generations. A chuckle is fleeting, but courage, spoken calmly in the face of condescension, can echo for centuries. And in that chamber on that day, she had shown the country that composure could be revolutionary. Viewers across the nation carried her words like a shield. For immigrants, it became a reminder that dignity transcends paperwork. For workers, that titles don't determine worth. For students, that arrogance is no substitute for knowledge. And for communities long dismissed or belittled, it was validation that respect is never owed to the powerful simply because they hold power. It is demanded by living with principle, by showing character in the small and great acts alike. The courtroom itself seemed to take on new meaning in her reflection. It was no longer just marble walls and solemn benches. It became a mirror of America's soul, sometimes clouded with ego, sometimes distorted by arrogance, but always capable of being clarified by truth. Crockett's stand reminded the country that the courtroom, like democracy itself, belongs not to the few who laugh, but to the many who believe. Her final reflection was not angry, nor triumphant. It was steady, measured, hopeful. She said, "This is not about me, and it's not even about him. It's about us, about the kind of country we choose to be. Will we be a nation that lets arrogance have the last word? Or will we be a nation where dignity stands tall, where truth outlasts mockery, and where character, not titles, defines respect?" The words lingered, not just as a closing statement, but as a challenge. They invited every listener to see themselves in that chamber, to ask whether they would stand silent when laughed at, or answer with calm conviction. In that invitation lay the moral clarity of the moment: dignity over arrogance, truth over mockery, character over titles, a lesson not confined to politics, but carried into every workplace, every classroom, every home. And as the echo of her words faded into history, America was left to consider its reflection, staring back, asking quietly but firmly, "Who are we, really?" The story began with a chuckle, a sound meant to diminish, to belittle, to remind Jasmine Crockett of the power stacked against her. But it ended with something far greater, a calm, unshakable answer that silenced not only Justice Kavanaugh, but the very arrogance his laughter represented. This wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a mirror held up to America itself. On one side, the smirk of privilege and dismissal. On the other, the steady voice of dignity, courage, and truth. Crockett showed the nation what it means to stand firm in the face of mockery, and to remind those watching that true power doesn't come from titles. It comes from character, and that's why this moment matters. It wasn't about one exchange between two individuals. It was about the countless times people across this country have been laughed at, underestimated, or dismissed, and the courage it takes to respond with grace instead of anger, with conviction instead of fear. So now the question comes to you. If you believe arrogance must always be met with dignity, share this moment. Let it travel further. Let it speak for those who need to be reminded that their voice, too, carries weight. If you want to see more stories where truth outshines mockery, where character defeats arrogance, and where ordinary people find extraordinary strength, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Comment below with your own experiences of standing tall against dismissal, because your story might inspire someone else. This is more than content. This is a movement for justice, for truth, for dignity, and together we can ensure that arrogance never has the last laugh again, because in the end, respect isn't granted by power. It's earned by character,